wasn't going to pay their families the $100 funeral fees, the gratuities, in the event of their death until this shutdown is resolved. Well, this could go on for weeks more, possibly even months more. We don't know how long it's going to last. Thanks to a private organization, they've stepped in and have agreed to pay these families until the government comes in and reimburses them. Well, earlier today, the House, this afternoon, I believe around a little before 2 o'clock Central Daylight Time, I learned that the House had unanimously voted to reinstate funding, at least for this portion of the military. Last week they authorized funding to pay our soldiers and our sailors and so forth their salaries, which was a good thing. But it was disgraceful, though, that they did not consider the possibility that, hey, there's a high degree of probability that some of these people might not make it home alive. The Obama administration gambled, and they got caught red-handed in not helping out soldiers. And that, in my opinion, brings no honor to the House of Obama or his administration to make that kind of an oversight. Yes, I'm a staunch supporter of this president, but this was a big, big screw-up. It's totally inexcusable. You're the commander-in-chief of all the armed forces of this country. You cannot afford to make that kind of mistake, Mr. President. That is a big screw-up. And some of my friends have accused me today of jumping ship and going to the Republican side. Far be it. To me, this is just a matter of honor. I would do this to no matter what president was in office. And partly I admit I have personal feelings on this. But I've had various members of my family who are in the military. The way I see it, the military promised you a chance at a career, whether you're enlisted or you're an officer. They have an obligation to fulfill their promises, and that includes providing you with a salary, training on the job, help you to get a job once you get out, and at some point you're going to need medical care, so you're going to need VA medical care. And I've seen over the years the federal government gradually reneging on that promise of medical care. My dad was a prime example of it. As a matter of fact, my dad decided to leave the private work sector in the early 80s to work at the VA hospital in Columbia in the housekeeping department. And I remember the extensive testing and background he went through to just get to that job. And it took a long time. And my dad was a very smart man. But the system is so convoluted that it took several months, even a couple of years, to finally get everything straightened out to where they would hire him. Well, along the way, my dad went through various personal crises, as we all do from time to time. And one of the things that bothers me is that the military, for all the good that they did for my dad, they were also responsible for some of his health issues, namely his hearing loss and some of his clinical depression, which led to substance abuse, namely prescription drugs and alcohol. Many people don't know this, and I won't dwell on it too much, but my dad had sued the United States government a few months before he died. And it was roughly about, I would say, a week, maybe. I think it was the Friday before he died, or 2 Fridays before he died, that he got confirmation from the federal government that they called him and notified him, his lawyer called him and notified him that they at least acknowledged that they were responsible for his hearing loss. My dad died satisfied knowing that the government finally admitted that they screwed up and damaged his hearing. Now, what happened was, my dad was in the United States Army from 1962 to 1965. Early on in his training, he was training in tanks to be in artillery, to fire those big shells and so forth. Well, back in the 60s, they did not require, at least by federal law, required by law to have hearing protection. So all that shelling going on, all the noise from the machinery, quickly damaged his hearing, and he became deaf to certain frequencies, especially to high-pitched frequencies. Now, those electronic beeps that you hear on your watch and so forth, my dad could not hear those frequencies. And I remember when he first started buying those digital watches in the late 70s and early 80s, he would mess around with them thinking the watches were broken. The watches were fine. My mom and I could hear them just fine. Even the old Dachshund we had at the time, Klaus, he could hear them just fine. And he took a couple of watches back because he wasn't convinced that we weren't pulling his leg. And as it turns out, the watches were fine. His hearing was damaged. So, fast forwarding to today, the military has an obligation, I feel, regardless of what branch you serve in, whether you are enlisted or you're an officer, whether you are drafted or not, the military, our government, has an obligation to fulfill. You risked your life to fight for our freedoms. The least we could do is to honor those basic promises that we made to you 5, 10, 15, 20, 35, 45, however many years ago, to fulfill that promise. And what the president did was not just a simple oversight. This could not have been an oversight. This might have been his way of trying to urge the Republicans into getting back into negotiations and to get this budget process going. Shame on you, Mr. President, if that is the case. That was cold-hearted. That was a cold-hearted maneuver. Now, I don't know if that was the case, but that's what I'm seeing. Now, I still support you. I still like you. But this was inexcusable. And as a taxpayer and as a patriot of this country, I'm not very happy about this. And I'm glad the House at least rectified the situation. We'll see what the Senate does. And hopefully by tomorrow, at this time, you will have signed this bill into law. So, I'll get off that part of the soapbox right now. Okay? Well, of course, the stalemate continues in the nation's capital amid new Republican offers to reopen the government and raise the debt limit in exchange for discussing cutting entitlements like Medicare and Social Security. Well, President Obama thanked the House Democrats in a Democratic caucus in a meeting at the White House, praising his legislative backers for holding firm against GOP demands to piecemeal funding for the government. The president signals more give on the idea of short-term debt deal, which, in my opinion, is not a good idea because we're going to face this crisis again like we did a few months ago with the possible shutdown earlier this year. Well, in a statement characterizing the meeting, the White House said the president and House Democrats reaffirmed their shared belief that we cannot let one faction of the Republicans in the House demand a ransom for doing its job and paying the bills we have already incurred. Well, the White House read out of the meeting portrayed President solely focused for fighting for working families and gave no indication that Obama intends to cave to Republican demands, which have now evolved from defunding the president's signature health care law to slashing in their minds the true drivers of America's swelling debt. And I'll say this, the Republicans can badmouth the Democrats all they want for all of this excessive spending, but you know what? There have been Republicans along the way that have endorsed this, otherwise a lot of this stuff wouldn't have passed. So you're just as guilty as the Democrats. Probably even more so for being hypocritical. Well, with the Affordable Care Act out, entitlements in, Republicans seem to be shifting the shutdown debt ceiling battle line from an argument over Obamacare to one over entitlements. Okay? They're trying to steer clear of the Affordable Care Act. It's like, okay, maybe we'll drive away from this. Maybe they won't see us moving over here. Well, after spending the first week of the shutdown trying to tie anything that would fund the government and end the impasse to President Barack Obama's healthcare law, the word Obamacare hasn't even come up much in recent days. Have you noticed that? The GOP dropping Obamacare in the shutdown debate. Republicans are saying they would be willing to talk about raising the nation's borrowing authority so long as it includes a discussion on cutting entitlements, which they say are at the core of the country's debt problem. Well, at a news conference on Monday, the president indicated Republicans could essentially set the agenda for budget negotiations, but only if Congress agrees first to a short-term spending plan to fund the government and raise the debt ceiling. Well, both the Senate and the House are moving forward without regard to each other. The House will vote to create a negotiating committee on a bill to ensure essential federal workers don't miss a paycheck. The Senate, meanwhile, is expected to reject that and will instead debate a proposal to raise the debt ceiling, which is expected to go nowhere in the House. I tell you, this is like a marriage in which both sides want what the other side doesn't want. And there seems to be no mediator here. And the president isn't helping the situation any. And it doesn't help that the vice president, of course, is the president of the Senate. So you got the Senate basically overriding the House, but they're not strong enough to push the House out of the way and saying, well, it's going to be this way. Well, the new face of the House gymnasium has reached the news. In an interview on the Bill Press show, and gleefully pointed out by a conservative group, Representative Bruce Braley, Democrat from Iowa, defends keeping the House gym open because it's where members can actually speak to each other. Well, if that's what it takes, then talk in there. I don't care. Pardon me. Well, the House gym, he argues, could solve this crisis. He might have a point. Now, remember what Eric Massa and Rahm Emanuel did in the House gym showers? Ugh, that doesn't sound good. Well, anyway, things are getting pretty rough. Braley, I believe it's Braley, who's running for the Senate in 2014, complains there's no towel service. But then he says, we're doing our own laundry down here. Oh, boo-hoo-hoo-hoo. I do my own laundry too. Get over it. This is how out of touch our congressional leaders are. I have to do my own laundry and I have to wash my own towels. Well, I bet you wipe your own ass too, don't you? Don't see anybody jumping for that job either. Well, he says members pay $260 per year to belong to a gym. To belong to this gym. Quick back of the envelope math suggests that members of Congress pay less than $22 per month to belong to the gym. That usually includes towel service and a heated pool and whatnot. You know, you can find a YMCA or a church gym that is about on that same level of funding, probably even cheaper. Well, Paul Ryan emerges from again. Remember Paul Ryan, representative, the Republican budget guru who was on the losing ticket in the 2012 election, Mitt Romney's cohort, and sometimes speaking voice? Yeah, that's the one. Well, he's still a member of Congress and still sits at the top of the budget committee. The budget wonk at the center of budget and spending battles in previous years broke his months-long silence this morning. In an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal, he took a measured tone saying both sides should agree to common sense reforms of the country's entitlement programs. Missing from his piece? Guess what? The word Obamacare. Any cruise is good news for Democrats, and that's a different tact than what many of his Tea Party-aligned colleagues want, which is the dismantling of the health care law. And Senator Ted Cruz's speechwriter noticed the omission too. And what about the vice president? Haven't heard much out of Joe Biden lately, have we? Seems that he's been sidelined. And this is where the president is really making a mistake. But maybe he knows what he's doing. Vice President Joe Biden. Well, the 2012